Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this ICIE conference in Dubai. I would love to be there in person, as I usually am, but circumstances didn't allow it, so I have to do it this way today. Nevertheless, we'll get you into an overview of a couple of projects I've been involved with over the last several years. Robert Sternberg and I have been working on interdisciplinary analyses of 21st century globalization and the ways it's impacting creative intelligence and giftedness and talent. So the project ended up producing 2 edited books. The one on the left is the one emphasizing creative intelligence, and it included insights from many of the leading thinkers in the interdisciplinary field of creative studies, as well as a few from general education. The one on the right was produced through the contributions of leading thinkers in the field of gifted education. So taken together, they provide overviews of insights having to do with the ways in which globalization is impacting young people in this complex world. Here is an incomplete list of some of the contributors to the book projects. You'll notice that there are quite a few recognizable names, journal editors from creative studies and gifted education, leading researchers and theorists in both of those fields. Also, you'll notice that the project involved contributors from around the world. Given that our topic was globalization, we wanted to make the project as global as possible. So we tried to gain contributions from all of the continents, and didn't succeed with a couple of continents, but got representation from around the world. And the intent there was to ensure that we weren't locking ourselves into a particular version of giftedness or creativity that might be emphasizing Western values in particular. We wanted to make sure it was a diverse set of perspectives on this project. When we first conceived of this project, we decided that we had to frame it in a particular way, and the framing involved my work on interdisciplinary discovery. For the last couple of decades, I've been diving into the research and theory in multiple academic disciplines, more than 25 of them in many of the projects I've done in the past. And I kept noticing that there were some themes emerging. One of those themes was the prospect of gigantic problems that are either unprecedented or growing beyond our capacity to handle them. And I called them macro problems. And in a prior set of projects, Bob Sternberg and I worked on macro problems through the lens of dogmatism. And then we also noticed that there are macro opportunities, giant opportunities that are either unprecedented or have grown to the point where they present us with prospects for fulfillment and prosperity that were not there before. The macro problems, you'll notice, are described as interdisciplinary because they cannot be solved from within the borders of a single academic discipline or professional field. They are international because they cannot be solved from within the borders of a single nation, no matter how powerful. And they are long-term because they took decades or even centuries to create, so they will take a long time to solve. So before getting deeper into the project, I thought it wise to give you a preview of some of the driving questions that either initiated some of the work of some of the contributors or emerged from their work. And one of those questions is the idea of exponential knowledge growth, presenting both an opportunity and a problem. The problem is the immense complexity that they present us with. As knowledge is doubling every 4 years in some fields, and growing rapidly in others, how can we possibly master all of it? But at the same time, it presents us with huge opportunities that we hadn't confronted before. And the graphics you see here are from another prior project in which a number of us analyzed academic fields and disciplines, the structure and dynamic of those fields, and noticing that some of them are unified, insular, and firmly policed, while other disciplines are fragmented, porous, and contested. We don't have time to get into the details about that, but the structure and dynamics of these fields are so different that academics have to work differently within them, and consequently they can't understand each other's work if they look beyond their own fields. So that just gives you a hint at some of the complexity of what's going on here. Another example of the driving questions that we focused on in this project is the question about ethics and inequality. We'll explore in more depth and detail the inequality issue a little bit later. But when you have a highly unequal society, especially one that's stretched around the world, the globalized world has created integration of societies, and inequality has become a big part of that, then ethics is magnified. So if we are working to develop the aspirations and talents of gifted young people in various parts of the world, and then they become adults and they don't have sufficient ethical awareness, then there's a possibility that they will do enormously harmful things, and those things will have magnified impact because of their talent and creativity. So that just illustrates another macro problem that we have to grapple with. So in order to frame the entire project, we thought it useful to look really long term. So we went all the way back into prehistory and then forward into the 21st century, thinking about transitions and changes over the course of that time period. And this model you're looking at now is an example of that perspective. It's called the ripple, the breaker, and the tsunami because it illustrates waves of change that have occurred throughout that very long time period from prehistory up to today's world. And the first wave of change is called the Agrarian Revolution. Before that time, most people on the planet lived in small hunter-gatherer groups of about 50 or less, and they were nomadic, and their lives wouldn't change significantly throughout the course of their existence. They would of course experience very different things from day to day, but the pattern of their lives would stay the same. During this time, there was a change going on, a profound change from nomadic hunter-gathering to movement into agrarian villages in which they began to domesticate crops and animals and not moving from one place to another. So they would live by the rising and setting of the sun and by the seasons. So that was an enormous change, but it occurred over several thousand years. So on the model, it's not very high in terms of the extent of change an individual would face throughout his or her lifetime. Move forward into the 18th and 19th centuries, and you have a second big wave of change occurring, the Industrial Revolution. And here we have most of those who moved into the agrarian villages are now moving into the rapidly growing cities and working in factories according to bells and whistles and clocks, and overseers, and living in row houses. So the existence was very different, and it occurred within a couple of centuries instead of several thousand years. Consequently, the wave was compacted and is higher in terms of the impact it had on an individual living at that time. And now we move forward into the early mid-20th century and all the way into the today's environment in the early 21st century. And we have another enormous wave of change occurring, and that's the globalized information revolution. Here we have the world being integrated tightly through information technology. Money and people move around rapidly with unpredictable consequences. And these events are causing a lot of big problems and big opportunities to arise, and that's what we're focusing on in this project. So this wave is very high in terms of the degree of change because of the compacting into a couple of decades instead of a couple of centuries or several millennia. Now that brings us to yet another model, this one called Catch a Wave. This model emerged from the interdisciplinary analyses I was doing prior to the project. For the last couple of decades, I've been navigating through the research and theory in about 25 academic disciplines and professional fields, and extracting insights that can be applied to research, theory, and practice in creative intelligence fields such as gifted education and general education. So this model pulls together, synthesizes a lot of the insights from that work and provides the basis for the focus chapter that we used to in turn provide a basis for the contributing authors. And the contributing authors analyzed globalization from that focus chapter through their lenses of expertise. And that provided the framework for the project. So looking at this model, you'll notice that the three dimensions it has, the dimension on the left-hand side that goes back into the depth dimension of the picture is a timeline from the early mid-20th century forward into today's world. And then the horizontal dimension is the development of socioeconomic and political problem solving capacities on the part of societies and on the part of individuals. And the success dimension is vertical on this model. So you'll notice that if you go to the back of the model, we have a linear arrow that moves forward and then rises upward somewhat, representing the success of a society or an individual existing at that time period. That success wasn't very profound. It was noticeable, but it wasn't very profound because it was limited to material acquisition. Materialism dominated throughout that era, and individualistic accumulation. And then we move forward into the 21st century, and there's a very different progress arrow here. One that moves forward to begin with like the other one, but then it splits off and one part of it moves forward underneath the wave, and the other part leaps to the crest of the wave and then breaks into multiple intertwining arrows. And those arrows signify the unpredictability of that environment. The 21st century globalized environment creates a lot of unpredictability. Also notice that there are macro opportunities and macro problems on this model. The macro opportunities are on the top of the globalization wave, signifying the fact that if we can leap to the crest of the wave, we will experience big opportunities that were unprecedented. Similarly, macro problems exist on the underside of the wave, and that indicates that if we are unsuccessful in our problem-solving capacities and initiatives, we will forge ahead under the wave, and at some point the macro problems will come crashing down on us and create lives that are poor, nasty, brutish, and short, to use the terminology of Thomas Hobbes, a rather pessimistic philosopher from a couple of hundred years ago. So the creative intelligence gap is the gap between where we are now in our intellectual, creative, problem-solving capacities and where we need to be to leap to the crest of the wave. A rather daunting space there. And the quantum leap is the leap we need to make to achieve success in a globalized world. Here we are looking at a number of examples of macro problems and macro opportunities. I mentioned earlier that macro problems are interdisciplinary, international, and long-term, and that macro opportunities are opportunities that we haven't had access to in the past because globalization is bringing with it enormous changes that could lead to prosperity and fulfillment for billions around the world. So the examples are color-coded. Blue indicates a macro problem and yellow indicates a macro opportunity. Notice that some of these examples are yellow only, which means that they are solely macro opportunities, or at least mostly macro opportunities. And the blue color indicates that they are solely macro problems. Some of them are a blend of the two, both yellow and blue, indicating that they are both a problem and an opportunity, and that depending on how we handle them, they'll move more toward one or toward the other. Just a few examples here. Exponential knowledge growth is both a problem and an opportunity for obvious reasons, which we might explain a little bit later. Runaway technology, the same thing there. Can we handle the technology we're creating that might bring us prosperity and fulfillment, or maybe some unpredictable devastation? Network science, the idea of scientific networking around the world, creating enormous opportunities that we haven't had before. The race for what's left has to do with resource shortages. Environmental degradation, including climate change, is a huge macro problem. Globalized free trade, which brings with it exploitative economics and severe inequality. More a macro problem than an opportunity, but it has the prospects of both. And then the growth and erosion of democracy around the world, another gigantic problem/opportunity. A couple of big macro problems: dogmatism, narrow-minded, short-sighted, superficial thinking, causing a lot of the macro problems that we face. Educational creaticide, the sanitizing and homogenizing of education worldwide, but more so in some countries than in others. Cognitive diversity, the opportunity to synthesize insights from diverse minds. And creative intelligence itself as a gigantic opportunity. Here's another version of the catch-a-wave model, this one aligned with trends in education. So the dimensions of the model signify a few different things. Notice that the Hobbes trap is still there, although in the case of education it has to do with creaticide, the killing of creativity in the education system, and apartheid, the severe inequality of educational opportunity due to the sanitizing of education system, sanitizing of creativity and purpose, due to the efforts of reformers. You'll also notice that there is a big circular arrow in which the USA and China are chasing each other. More on that a little bit later, but in essence this has to do with the fact that China is waking up to the notion that their system doesn't fit the 21st century, and American policymakers haven't yet had that glimmer of awareness. So they're chasing each other, trying to copy each other. So more on that later. So now we're going to have a closer look at some of these macro opportunities and macro problems. The first of them, cognitive diversity, based on the work of economist and complexity theorist Scott Page, has to do with the effectiveness of teams and the idea that teams can be made up of diverse groups or homogeneous groups. So the work on this, the research on it, conclusively shows that a diverse team will outperform a homogeneous team when complex problems are being solved. So if you took 6 Nobel Prize winners, for example, and put them in one room of this building, and then took 6 of us and put us in a room across the hall from them, and assume that for a minute that the economists are smarter than us in measured intelligence. I don't think they necessarily are, but let's just pretend they are for the sake of the scenario. Now, if you give both teams the same highly complex problem that isn't just about economics, it'll likely have a number of bodies of knowledge involved in it, and ask them to work on it, we are almost certain to outperform that group of economists every time. And the reason for it is they are a homogeneous group with the same beliefs, the same, likely similar cultural backgrounds, same philosophical perspectives, the same theoretical frameworks. Whereas our idea systems will be very different from theirs in terms of the interaction of the group. If we can get beyond our differences, then the diversity of our minds will enrich the problem solving. So that's an enormous advantage if we can overcome our dogmatism and fear of outsiders. Along similar lines, another macro opportunity is networked science. This, based on the work of Nielsen, who's a physicist, has to do with the opportunity created by online scientific networking around the world. So we have international, somewhat interdisciplinary collaboration occurring in very unpredictable ways. The graphic here is looks like a desert landscape. Its vertical dimension represents success, and you'll notice that there are flat plains, and there are sinkholes, and there are mesas, and there are pinnacles on it. These represent problem-solving initiatives, efforts, and outcomes. So the orange arrow represents an insular, dogmatic individual or small group. And that individual or group is going to navigate around on the environment and then eventually fall into a sinkhole representing failure because of the insularity of that group or individual. The blue arrow represents an insular individual or group, but it's a highly intelligent one or highly creative one. And its creative intelligence is going to enable it to achieve some success on the model, but that success is going to be limited in terms of elevation on the model. This group or individual is going to end up on a mediocre solution mesa, again, because of its insularity. The green dots on the landscape represent individuals coalescing to come together and synthesize their insights, which will enable them to climb to the top of an optimal solution pinnacle, achieving a very high level of success. Example of that was the Polymath project, in which a Fields Medal-winning mathematician was trying to solve a very difficult math problem that nobody had been able to crack in the past. And this person achieved a little bit of success, but not very much, and decided to post the results online. And then ideas and insights started to trickle in and soon started to flood in. And at some point, a few weeks later, the success of that problem-solving group was very profound. The math problem had been solved based on contributions of little bits of micro-expertise from around the world. So they weren't just prominent mathematicians doing this contributing. There were high school math teachers in New Zealand and accountants from different parts of the world contributing. So that's an enormous macro opportunity for us. Here's another phenomenon that's mostly a macro problem. The race for what's left has to do with resource shortages around the world. So shortages of arable land, fresh water, rare minerals, and energy are causing extraction companies to take risks they hadn't before, like the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico as an example of that problem. And it's also causing international tension and leading toward possible conflict, like the conflicts between China and other nations in the South China Sea, for example. Another is the possible conflict over petrochemicals in the Arctic Ocean as the ice cap recedes. So we have Russia, the USA, and several other countries possibly leading to some kind of conflict in that region. So that's going to lead to international conflict and possibly more environmental devastation. And that is related to another macro problem, an enormous one over the long term, and that's climate change. There's some argument over climate change. In essence, the climate scientists have provided a very clear picture of what's to come if we don't change our behaviors. And those who disagree usually disagree for reasons of dogmatism or short-sighted individual interest. But it's an enormous macro problem because it threatens the viability of life on Earth as we know it, leading to a lot of big problems that are already occurring: rising sea levels, flooding, severe droughts. We're going to get wetter where things are already humid and drier where things are already dry. So deserts are going to grow and grasslands are going to turn into deserts. Storms are going to become more severe. Resource shortages are going to be more pronounced. We're going to have mass extinctions. We already have that occurring. Epidemics as diseases move into locations that they didn't previously exist. And finally, the issue of environmental refugees. The Syrian refugee crisis that your region is experiencing right now is normally thought of as a political thing and a political conflict, and it largely is. But behind that is the effects of climate change that are causing severe droughts in those regions, aggravating the problems that they are having to the extent where people just have to pick up and move because they have no choice. And here is another macro problem, macro opportunity hybrid, the growth and erosion of democracy around the world. Right now, there are more democracies in the world than there ever have been in the past, and democracy continues to spread, which is a good thing. However, the developed nations that have had democracy for a long time are actually experiencing democratic erosion. Democracy is not an either-or. You either have it or you don't, and you have totalitarianism. There actually are shades of gray between democracy and totalitarianism. So if you look at the model here, think of that circle as a clock face with 12 o'clock at the top, representing a strong democracy, and totalitarianism at 6 o'clock at the bottom, representing the exact opposite, and what you absolutely do not want to have in a nation. The nuance, the shades of gray in between democracy and totalitarianism, comes from movement down the sides or up through the middle. Movement up through the middle, democratic growth, occurs through a widespread epistemic power, which means widespread knowledge of what's going on economically and culturally in a society, as opposed to deception of the populace by propagandistic media. Distributive or deliberative participation. So the citizenry is actively involved in the democracy, meaning that they vote, but they also actively participate in town meetings and governance to the extent they can. And then prudent regulation, meaning that the government does exert some control over the economy and the culture, but doesn't do so excessively. Notice the double-ended arrow at the top of the model with right-wing beliefs on the right-hand side, individualism, economic freedom for individuals to become entrepreneurial, and limited government, meaning getting the government out of the way so that they will, so that the individuals can achieve creative things. Those are all good when they work. On the other side of the arrow, left-wing beliefs in community, let's do things for each other, not just for ourselves. Distributive justice, making sure that the economy serves everyone instead of just a fortunate elite few. And regulation, the government actually gets in and does some things to protect individuals and the society. So these two sets of beliefs are in dynamic tension with each other. And when they are in dynamic tension and balanced, we tend to end up with a strong democracy. It's when one side of the system comes to dominate the other that we end up with erosion down toward totalitarianism. So these red numbers on the model indicate where systems have been in the past. And the number 1, for example, would show you where Nazi Germany and Pinochet's Chile were in totalitarian right-wing territory. And the number 2 shows you where Stalin's Soviet Union and Pol Pot's Cambodia were in totalitarian left-wing territory. Number 5 would indicate a society eroding toward totalitarianism through excessive belief in right-wing tenets. And a number 6 would represent erosion toward totalitarianism down the left-wing side. Number 3 would represent a slight right-wing, a bit off-center, and number 4, slight left-wing, a bit off-center, but in fairly healthy territory. So this is a macro problem because we end up with democratic erosion occurring in the globalized world, but it's also an opportunity because of the growth of democracy worldwide. So related to democratic growth and erosion is another macro problem, primarily a macro problem, and that is socioeconomic inequality within and between nations around the world. Social epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have done a lot of work on this, synthesizing the research on international comparisons of societies and their levels of inequality. This model illustrates some of those findings. So you end up with societies that are more unequal over on the right-hand side of the model, and those that are more egalitarian on the left-hand side. And the vertical dimension shows the levels of social problems they have. The more social problems a society has, the higher it is on the model. And if a society is experiencing fewer of those social problems or less pronounced problems, then it will be lower on the model. Notice the tight correlation between inequality and social problems, represented by that line across the diagonal line across the model. Notice that a few countries are down in the lower left corner, more egalitarian, fewer social problems. The Scandinavian countries are in that region of the model, Japan as well, a few others. And then noticeably, the USA, Portugal, and the United Kingdom are in the upper right-hand corner. The USA in particular has the most severe inequality and the most severe social problems. The social problems looked at through the Wilkinson and Pickett lens include life expectancy. The more unequal societies have lower life expectancy. Educational performance, math and literacy performance, are suppressed in the more unequal societies. Infant mortality is higher, violence and imprisonment are higher, teen pregnancies are higher, levels of trust are lower. The people just don't trust each other in unequal societies. Mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, are much higher. And finally, social mobility. The chance that a child will achieve a higher level of prosperity than his or her parents is much lower in the more unequal societies. So ironically, if you look at the United States as a primary example on this, the American dream is often promoted as an ideology in the USA. The idea that if you are talented and work hard, you will achieve success. And that is true in any society to some extent, but it's much harder in the unequal societies. So social mobility is lower in the USA than it is in the other developed nations, in spite of the promotion of the American dream. As Wilkinson and Pickett often say in their international presentations, if you want to live the American dream, you had better move to Denmark. So these levels of inequality in the more unequal nations lead to a number of disturbing phenomena, including the outsourcing of well-paying jobs to third world slave-like sweatshops, indentured servitude returning. One example of that might be considered the exploitation of the young people by the financial industry through exorbitant interest rates on and entrapment in student loan debt. Inverted totalitarianism is a term invented by the prominent social scientist Sheldon Wallen, who said that we are totalitarian in a globalized society because a global financial and corporate elite actually controls the levers of power. It's not a severe form of totalitarianism as you would find in Stalin's Soviet Union or Hitler's Nazi Germany, but it's totalitarian nonetheless, which leads to a form of plutocracy, rule by and for the rich. So that leads us to another interesting question is, we mentioned briefly before, are we promoting the ascendance of psychopaths in our society through gifted programming? And of course, not every child in a gifted program is a psychopath, but are we actually selecting psychopaths and training them to be more psychopathic through the ideology that underlies some of the gifted programs around the world? That's a really interesting question that deserves some attention. Are we enabling them to develop their talents and creativity so they will lead creative, unethical, and massively destructive careers? An example of that may be from the financial industry, in which they created really interesting and impressive financial instruments that no one else could understand, and exploited the economy to the point where they actually undermined it and created the 2008 economic collapse, harming the lives of billions around the world while they walked away with enormous amounts of cash. This leads us to our most serious macro problem, which is dogmatism. Bob Sternberg and I did 2 books on dogmatism previously because we were so interested in its causes and effects. Dogmatism is short-sighted, narrow-minded, superficial, locked-in thinking. And we consider it the most serious macro problem because it creates all of the others. It creates exploitative economics. It creates dogmatism and locked-in democratic erosion. It leads to the ascendance of authoritarianism. It can even lead to genocide. Some of the researchers on the psychopath, for example, wrote a book called Snakes in Suits, representing the idea that psychopaths are overrepresented in the corporate executive ranks. So that's just one manifestation of dogmatism. So this brings us back to the education system, the catch-a-wave model, illustrating the structure and dynamics of 21st century education. want to focus a little bit more on this ironic circular chase between the USA and China, that primarily coming from the work of several scholars who have been studying Chinese education and comparing it with the American. Most prominent among these is Yang Zhao, who is a Chinese scholar who's worked in both China and the USA for extended time periods. And he's written a number of books on this that have made an impact. One of them is titled Catching Up or Leading the Way, which is an analysis of the extent to which the USA is ahead or behind China educationally. And another is subtitled China Has the Best and the Worst Education System in the World. And the reason he's talking about education in those ways is that he perceives Chinese policymakers as recognizing the need for a shift in its education system away from a hyper-mechanistic, accountability-driven system like we are trying to achieve here in the USA. And the Chinese are attempting to move more toward an American model that allows for creative and critical thinking and constructivism and collaboration. So the American system, in contrast, is trying to move away from that and moving toward the Chinese mechanistic accountability-driven system, because the American policymakers, the dogmatic, superficial thinkers in American policy, are attempting to copy a system that gets good test scores. So that leads you to think about what do those test scores mean, and we'll look at that shortly. But also on this model, you'll notice the Hobbes trap is including Creaticide and Apartheid. In the prior Dogmatism projects that we did a few years ago, David Berliner, a prominent educational psychologist, wrote a chapter on Creaticide, which he coined that term to stand for the systematic killing of creativity in the American education system through excessive accountability and standardized testing. And Apartheid this is written about by a number of critics, including Diane Ravitch. And Apartheid is based on the old unethical stratification of a society as occurred in South Africa in the late 20th century. But here, the critics of the reform movement in the USA are using it to stand for the separation and segregation of populations of students by school reformers who are selecting their students for charter schools, for example, and private schools, and leaving the vast majority behind, those who are underprivileged, in schools that are being drained of creativity and resources. So that leads us to educational creaticide, a little bit more on this. The idea of misguided notions of school reform destroying those education systems. So what happens when dogmatic simpletons and profiteering foxes in hen houses take over the education system to make it operate the way they think it should, which is not very insightful, or to make it a profit-centered business for themselves, and they end up caring little about the kids in those systems and more about the profit that they might make from them. Not too long ago, I worked on a metaphorical model, another visual metaphor, representing the spectrum of the intellect, or the spectrum of human capacities. This is based on the idea that you can think of intellect as similar to the electromagnetic spectrum. So if you look at this model, we have above this double-ended arrow the electromagnetic spectrum with visible light in the middle, the Roy G. Biv standing for the colors in the rainbow. The color is the part of the spectrum that is visible to the human eye. Beyond that, things like ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, microwave, radio waves, infrared, and more are really important parts of the spectrum that support our technology and support a lot of the phenomena that go on in the world. But they are not that detectable by our senses. Consequently, we ignored them long ago before we had the tools to discover them. So they're out in the hinterland that were largely ignored by the human perception. Similarly, below that double-ended arrow, we have a set of abilities that are inside this narrow band, superficial, narrow, standardized test scores. And they're visible because they are cheap and easy to measure through large-scale standardized testing. But outside that are the invisible abilities. They're invisible because they are complex and difficult to measure through standardized scores. So we have things like visual metaphorical insight that Albert Einstein used to discover insights about relativity. Panoramic scanning means long range and broad scope interdisciplinary thinking. Reliability, resiliency, interpersonal collaboration, courage, practical intelligence, as Sternberg talks about, the idea that we can be academically bright but practically dumb. Other kinds of creative thinking, WICS, the wisdom, intelligence, and creativity synthesized. CPS, creative problem solving. Aesthetic appreciation, the aesthetics that great scientists use to discover insights. Without aesthetic appreciation, they wouldn't get anywhere. Altruism, interdisciplinary work. Intrinsic motivation and long-term purpose. Deferring judgment and maintaining intellectual humility. So finally, we're going to have a look at the skills and abilities required for success in the 21st century. We foreshadowed them in the spectrum of the intellect, or spectrum of human capacities. But here they are in a little more depth and detail. First, we have intrapersonal discovery of aspirations, interests, strengths, weaknesses, talents, and then using the insights gleaned from that discovery process to generate purposeful self-direction throughout a lifetime. Guided by contextual intelligence, the notion of being aware of one's context and finding a better context if needed. Creative and critical thinking and inquiry-based dispositions, being able to imagine, to think divergently, to perceive patterns in complexity, to employ nuanced judgment, perceiving shades of gray between black and white polarized issues. Ethical awareness and personal and social responsibility. These have always been important, but they're far more important now than they ever were before, because we can create and aggravate macro problems much more easily than we could before in the complex 21st century environment. And we need to be aware of the fact that we are creating those macro problems, and we must take action against that. Notice that deep level proficiency in the subject areas comes later in the list. That doesn't necessarily signify they're unimportant, but they are more a side effect of all of the other abilities coming together than they are the primary purpose of education. And deep level means that you're not just skating through the curriculum, gaining a superficial mastery of content. Big picture awareness, very important for all citizens in the 21st century. Certainly important for those who lead societies, but everyone should have at least some ability to do this so they're not deceived into contributing to the macro problems. So we have to be able to capitalize on cognitive diversity, as mentioned earlier, being interdisciplinary thinkers and being aware of other cultures. Visual thinking is on here because it sustains the visual metaphorical insights that great scientists have used to come up with their groundbreaking work. Information technology skills, that one's obvious. So is the idea of being entrepreneurial and savvy about financial and economic things. But we might also think about individuals being entrepreneurial about their own navigation through life because of its unpredictability in today's world. And interpersonal and collaborative teamwork is really important as well. All of this might be pulled together into another model, this upward spiral of growth towards self-fulfillment, in which you have aspirations on one side and talent development or capacities on the other side. So as a young child develops an aspiration or a goal for achievement, he or she is going to discover talents, and those talents are going to reinforce the aspiration, and there will be a back and forth elevation up this spiral toward high-level achievement and self-fulfillment over the long term. And finally, back to this notion of the creative intelligence gap. Can we leap to the top of the globalization wave from where we currently are? We are on the lower level of the catch-a-wave model, and we need to leap to the crest of the wave to escape the macro problems and capitalize on the macro opportunities. There is some evidence that we have the ability to do this. The very fact that you were at this conference, the ICIE conference, is a suggestion that we have some hope for achieving that. As mentioned earlier in the session, the ICIE has been an inspiration to me. It's been an inspiration to many others. It's my favorite organization for the very reason that it looks at the long term. It engages in panoramic scanning. It promotes talent development and ethics over the long term. Another very promising initiative is the Lost Prizes International teamwork that's been initiated by the University of Winnipeg faculty in Canada and spread around the world. The Lost Prizes initiative discovers talents and aspirations in individuals who have been suppressed and deprived in terms of their talent development, and end up in life paths that are devastating over the long term. So they discover people who are drug abusers or incarcerated because of crimes, and they end up rescuing them or helping them figure out ways to rescue themselves. And we're going to need a lot more of that in the future. So those first two groups are doing some really impressive work. Another example here is the Good Project. It used to be called the Good Works Project, started by William Damon, Howard Gardner, and Mahalia Csikszentmihalyi. I hope I pronounced that right because he's Croatian. Every time I've tried to pronounce anything Croatian, it's always been wrong. But those three and a few others were involved in creating the Good Works Project. And so now they're trying to find ways to help people achieve excellence, engagement, and ethical work over the long term. So that, in essence, is a very brief overview of enormously complex problems and opportunities in the 21st century. I'm confident that we're moving in the right direction, at least many of us are, and the fact, that, again, that you are working in this conference and working back home on interesting, productive initiatives gives me hope for the future. I wish you well in those endeavors and good luck in the future. Thanks very much, and I'm available to take questions.